How loud enough? Cool. Right. No slides yet. Is everyone having a good day? Say again? Cool. Sweet. Yeah. Hey, everyone. My name is Mike. I work at the Ethereum Foundation. And the title of my talk is ETH is Permissionless Money. But the subtitle is the ticker is ETH. Cool. So I'm going to split the talk into two halves. The first, I'll talk about what it means for ETH to be permissionless. And the second half, we'll talk about what it means for ETH to be money. So to motivate the permissionlessness, I have a few quotes. First, from Hayek in The Road to Serfdom. What our generation has forgotten is that a system of private property is the most important guarantee of freedom. And the second is very similar, from Milton Friedman. I think that nothing so important for freedom as recognizing in the law each individual's natural right for property. So both of these kind of are the core thing that brought me into crypto in the first place, which is this self-sovereignty, self-custody over digital property. So let's talk about property rights of ETH kind of on the L1 first and foremost. And I'd like to summarize this with kind of the one-sentence description, which is anyone can permissionlessly store, send, and program ETH, the native asset. Right? This is kind of table stakes for what Ethereum was trying to be in the very first place. And it's actually pretty wild if you think about it, right? Like, you can send money globally for, a few cents, and no one can stop that. And importantly, like, that is this censorship resistance and private property and settlement assurances that ETH provides that gives it the true differentiation from the traditional financial rails that we have today. So I have a diagram to help kind of map this out, and we'll use many of these diagrams as we talk about scaling ETH asset and scaling property rights to other ecosystems too. So here we have ETH mainnet, we have a few accounts, we have Uniswap, which is a contract. So kind of the first primitive that we have is this transfer, right? This is the ability to send ETH from one account to another. We also, of course, have this ability to program ETH, and the canonical example here is that we can send money from the account number 3 to Uniswap. The pool allows us to swap it for DAI. And this is kind of like the original promise of ETH and the programmability of ETH on the layer 1 itself. But as we all know, Ethereum is not just the L1 at this point, right? Like, it has grown to much broader ecosystems, and there's now all of these rollups. And part of Ethereum's scaling plan is actually through the rollup-centric roadmap. So the natural next question is to say, OK, what are the property rights of ETH on rollups themselves? And here I'm using rollups in the canonical sense, which is these are Ethereum smart contract rollups that post their transaction data to Ethereum blobs. So that's like a very important distinction, and we'll talk about how that actually impacts the property rights of ETH across rollups versus other L2s. The one-sentence summary here is that anyone can permissionlessly bridge ETH in and out of rollups. And this isn't to say that you will be able to do any DeFi activity or you'll be able to buy any NFT on any rollup permissionlessly, because rollups make some sacrifices in terms of the decentralization in order to actually scale to be able to handle like global volume. But the core property rights of ETH come from the ability to bridge in and out permissionlessly, no matter what the sequencer does to you. So to kind of represent this, we have a second diagram. And this diagram has kind of expanded a little bit. We now have Ethereum mainnet on the left. We have included the DA layer here, and the blobs are represented as those kind of pink circle things. And then we also have an Ethereum rollup on the right. And the first kind of operation is we send ETH from an account into the bridge. The bridge is just a smart contract that lives on Ethereum mainnet. And that bridging in is reflected in the Ethereum rollup state. So now we're credited account 1 with some amount of ETH, and the underlying ETH is actually locked in this bridge on the Ethereum L1. Of course, you can transfer ETH on the rollup, you can do DeFi on the rollup, you can buy your favorite NFT. But the thing I'm going to focus on is the ability to withdraw your ETH from that rollup permissionlessly. So let's say that the rollup sequencer went offline or started censoring you for whatever reason. You still have this ability to force withdraw. And the force withdraw to me is the most important part of interacting with a rollup, which is you still retain the strong property rights of ETH no one's able to censor or block that transaction. And that's kind of like why Ethereum rollups are scaling not only Ether's block space and the ability to consume and interact and do cool stuff on chain, but they're also scaling the property rights of ETH asset itself. The forced withdrawal is able to process because it can check the validity of that withdrawal against Ethereum's DA itself. So this is kind of the important precondition that says, hey, this Ethereum block also has a commitment to some set of transactions that took place on the L2, and that allows us to process the withdrawal fully. So again, this is kind of part of the rollup-centric roadmap, and it's what makes rollups in particular such a special construction for scaling Ether, the asset. Cool. So the third and kind of final permissionless use of ETH that I'm going to talk about is how the property rights of ETH on non-Ethereum DA L2s look. And this is a bit of a mouthful, but the one-sentence summary here, I put the kind of important part up front and italicized it, which is if the external DA layer is live, anyone can permissionlessly bridge ETH in and out. So now suddenly, like, the property rights of our assets have changed, right? It's no longer just Ethereum. It's no longer the decentralization of the whole Ethereum validator set, but actually now you have an external dependency. And that fundamentally changes the sovereignty of the assets that you're holding in that rollup. Now, that's not to say that no one should ever use a non-Ethereum DA rollup. I think there's places for that, you know, SocialFi, gaming, and these types of things, but I still feel like any activity that needs the strong settlement assurances and strong property rights of Ether, the asset, needs to take place on Ethereum rollup itself. Right, third diagram. So we've kind of added something different, which is this other blockchain. Now, it doesn't necessarily have to be another blockchain. It could be just, you know, an Amazon Web Services cluster that's running in US East 1. But the important thing is that there's an external source of DA. And this is where the transaction data is being posted for the L2. So the bridging in looks very much the same as before. You send ETH from an account into the bridge. The bridge is a smart contract on Ethereum L1, which gets reflected into the account on the Ethereum Optimium. I'm using Optimium as shorthand. This is the word we use to describe optimistic L1s that post their DA to an external data source. Again, you can do all of the kind of money verbs that we described before as long as the L2 that is sequencing those transactions is online and is not censoring you. But we're not too interested in that. We're curious still about the property rights of ETH as it pertains to when you hold it and bridge it over to the Optimium. And there's still a forced withdrawal mechanism. This is kind of the same pattern that we saw before of you need to get your ETH out and kind of withdraw it to the base chain. Let's just say the sequencer is offline. But suddenly you have this dependency, which is you need to check the validity of that forced withdrawal against some external data source. Now, this could be totally fine, and in the happy path, hopefully that withdrawal will be processed normally. But again, this is kind of the security trade-off that you make by interacting with this system that doesn't fully depend only on Ethereum itself. Cool. And before we go into the moneyness stuff, I also wanted to kind of point out the fact that USDC and USDT have no property rights, right? I think a common misconception is that like people think, oh, programmable money, like USDC is great. It's an ERC20 token. I can send it into all these smart contracts. It has all these nice interfaces that are exposed. But fundamentally, this is neobank money, right? So these two Dune dashboards show the number of blocked or blacklisted addresses for Tether on the left, or sorry, USDC on the left and USDT on the right. And effectively, if Jeremy O'Leary decides that you don't have access to your property, he can shut off the access to your USDC. So this is very similar to the traditional financial world where the government has control over your own property, and you should be aware of that when you're using these tokens. So in one sentence, this. Right. So to summarize, the permissionlessness of Ether, the asset, ETH is permissionless and programmable on the L1. Rollups scale the property rights of ETH. Property rights on non-Ethereum DA L2s depend on another chain. And USDC and USDT have no property rights. Cool. So now jumping into the second half, we're going to talk about ETH is money. And to motivate this section, I have two quotes. The first is another macroeconomist, John Maynard Keynes, by the continuing process of inflation, governments can confiscate, secretly and unobserved, an important part of the wealth of their citizens. So this kind of motivates why so much attention is paid to the monetary properties and the supply of either the asset, in particularly the inflation rate and how that redistributes wealth between the people who are being kind of inflated against and those who are protected against that inflation. And the second is a quote from David Graeber. Money has no essence. It's not really anything. Therefore, its nature has always been, and presumably always will be, a matter of political contention. So the point here is to say that this is just my view of what ETH is money means, and hopefully, this helps inform and kind of give you a framing for thinking about it for your own context, but this is certainly not like the end-all be-all of the discussion of what ETH is money actually means. Cool. So to start, I thought it would be useful to do a brief history of the Ether supply. So on the far left, we have 2016. This is like right post-Genesis. And on the far right, we have today. And we see that the supply has gone through kind of a few big regime changes. And I'll highlight 5 different time stamps. So first, in October 2017, we had the Byzantium hard fork, which changed the Ethereum block reward from 5 ETH per block to 3 ETH per block. This is important because it changes the slope of the inflation or of the supply growth over time. Very similarly, in 2019, we had the Constantinople hard fork, and EIP 1234 reduced that 3 ETH block reward to a 2 ETH block reward. In August 2021, the London hard fork introduced EIP 1559, and this is when the burn was activated. And we'll talk about the burn in a little bit, but the kind of key feature in the total supply is that we see that instead of being like a straight monotone increasing line, we now have some variability in the growth of the supply. And that variability comes from the amount of ETH being burned through transaction fees. And that's variable, it depends on demand, but now we're kind of into this regime of burning ETH along with the inflationary pressure from the issuance. The kind of most important point, I would say, in this plot is September 2022. This was the merge, no more proof of work rewards, and you can see that at that point, we've basically stopped the growth of the supply of Ether. And the last point is in March 2024, earlier this year, the Devcon hard fork introduced 4844, in which blobs arrived. And yeah, effectively, some of the activity that was taking place on the L1, some of the activity that was burning ETH on the L1 migrated to L2s. But the overall impact on the total supply is almost negligible, right? Like you barely see that inflection point, and that's kind of a key takeaway too of the overall supply mechanics of ETH currently. Cool. So briefly, I'll do some back of napkin math for what the current ETH inflation rate is. I think it's interesting and kind of going through the numbers. So there's 120 million Ether supply, and about 28% of it, or 34 million, is staked. At that stake rate, that corresponds to about a 3.25% yield, meaning that over the course of a year, we have 1.1 million new ETH created, which is less than 1% annual inflation, right? So like compared to fiat money, this is already way better, all things considered. Solana inflation looks a little different. They have a supply of 588 million tokens, and 400 million of them are staked, which is about 68%, and at a 7% yield. So this corresponds to 28 million supply, increase in supply each year, or a 4.7% annual inflation rate, so 5 times higher than Ether inflation. It's also interesting to look at Bitcoin inflation. Now, it's kind of confusing because people don't think of Bitcoin as inflationary, but of course there still are block rewards, and the current amount of circulating supply is only 19.78 of the total 21 million Bitcoin. And for the next 4 years, there'll be 3.125 Bitcoin per block, corresponding, based on the 52,000 blocks per year, to 164,000 Bitcoin per year. So the takeaway here is that the 0.8% inflation annually is about the same as the Ether inflation, which is kind of interesting to think about. Now, of course, Billion does have this 21 million promise, and that is the inflation rate of Bitcoin gets cut in half every 4 years in perpetuity. And this is from the Satoshi white paper. It says, once a predetermined number of coins have entered circulation, the incentive can transition entirely to transaction fees and be completely inflation-free. Now, this sounds great in theory, right? Like, there was the Maynard Keynes quote about inflation being the way that the government taxes us. However, there's still kind of this fundamental question, which is, how does the instability of proof of work with only transaction fees get resolved, right? And in particular, this plot shows transaction fees of Bitcoin over the past 6 years. And you can see that there's about a 2-year period from mid-2022 to mid-2023, mid-2021 to mid-2023, rather, where the average fees generated during each Bitcoin block was like far less than a single Bitcoin itself. So the kind of question that naturally arises is, how can you sustain the economic security of a chain based on such low amount of transaction fees over like a 2-year time horizon? And that's why Ethereum's kind of long-term issuance policy is not to actually go to zero, but to have both inflation and burn. And during periods of high volatility, the burn will absorb a lot of that inflation. Maybe we'll go net deflationary. Maybe we'll kind of just offset inflation altogether. But during periods of lower activity, lower volatility, kind of the natural recessionary kind of downturn, then there's still incentive to behave honestly in the system, and the kind of overall micro decisions that stakers need to make should still be aligned with behaving honestly and following the protocol rules. One kind of really interesting example is when Babylon Chain launched. This was just a few weeks ago, 12 weeks ago. The Bitcoin block reward went from 0.3 Bitcoin per block to 15.5 over the course of 4 blocks, right? So this is actually a 500x increase in the value of a block over the course of 40 minutes. So clearly this is a situation which would call into question the stability of the fork choice rule when someone mining on this chain sees that they have a 500x opportunity if they try and remove the latest block on the chain and create one of their own. So again, this is a question that's still unanswered in terms of how the long-term security model of Bitcoin will resolve itself. So the takeaway here, ETH has low and sustainable inflation, and we haven't even talked about the burn, right? We're 17 minutes into the talk about money, and we haven't even talked about the burn. How crazy is that? So first, I'll kind of cruise through this because the burn stuff is well covered by many people, including Justin and the Ultrasound Money meme. So we're currently burning about 476,000 Ether per year, which is after, like this is the 30-day level, and this is after a lot of activity has already migrated to the L2. So when people talk about the burn going to zero, it's like clearly not true. We're still burning almost half of the total issuance per year, just from L1 transaction fees. And obviously this depends highly on market conditions. So during high periods of volatility, like the past few days, when ETH is pumping, when everything's going crazy, then we might end up burning a lot more than during quieter times. So this is kind of what I mean when the burn absorbs large amounts of this inflation and kind of serves as this business cycle adjustment to the total supply. And yeah, just a reminder that the current inflation is only 1 million ETH per year. Now we also have burn from the blob fees, right? So one cool thing about L2 usage and the kind of roll-up-centric roadmap that we defined earlier is that the L2s that post blobs to Ethereum DA actually pay for that service. Currently, they don't pay much because the blobs are cheap. But in the future, there's a world where the average L2 transaction can remain very cheap, but the blob fees actually do meaningfully offset the current ETH inflation. And so just one last napkin math calculation. So if we have a DA layer with 128 blobs per slot and 2 gigagas, that's 2 billion gas per second, that could correspond to either 95,000 transactions per second or 6,000 swaps. That's just the total raw amount of gas that could be exposed through a DA layer of that size. Now, to fully offset that issuance, each of those 95K transfers would only cost 1/10 of a cent, right? $0.001. And each of the swaps would be about 1.5 cents. The blobs themselves, all 300 million of them that are posted over a year, would only cost $10. So the real TLDR here is that transaction fees can stay insanely low and still burn a lot of ETH. And this is kind of part of the beauty of actually like growing the block space and allowing more people to come on chain and grow the user adoption while still kind of seeing some of the benefit of burning that comes from the blob fees. Right. ETH money summary. ETH supply is relatively stable. Inflation is low and sustainable. The burn from L1 activity offsets half of the current inflation, and L2 activity burns blob fees. So I have 38 seconds left to do the full picture, and it's basically just summarizing everything I said in a single diagram. I love diagrams. I love drawing these things. So yeah, we have kind of 3 concentric circles. And I like to think of this as kind of the range of on-chain growing in terms of security, but also like hopefully opening up to more and more users. So at the core, we have the L1. Then we have the rollups as we defined them earlier, and optimiums at the farthest circle. So first, talking about permissionlessness. At the L1, ETH can be transmitted and programmed. On the rollups, you have this forced withdrawal mechanism that imbues the same property rights to ETH on the L2s than on rollups that it has on the L1. And on optimiums, you have the forced withdrawal mechanism that depends on the external DA. So all of these kind of come together and form this permissionless story for Ether, the asset, across the ecosystem. Going the other direction, we have the moneyness properties of ETH, the asset. So we have the burn on the L1. We have blob burn from rollups that consume Ethereum DA. And on optimiums, we spread Ether as a medium of exchange and unit of account. These two terms are kind of what macroeconomics people usually use to describe money, and we didn't get to talk about it too much today. But basically, spreading Ether as an asset that people care about, can transact with, and can use, even in optimiums and kind of side chains and all sorts of other constructions, I think is super valuable. And that's why I think ETH is money, too. So together, this is the whole picture of why I think ETH is permissionless money. And thank you very much for your time.
Thank you so much, Mike. Great meeting you in person, by the way. We have tons of questions here from the audience. We'll try to fit in on the 5 minutes we have. The first question is, when you were talking about rollups, you mean the stage 2 rollups specifically?
Yeah, so just a little context. Stage 2 defines kind of some of the security properties of rollups that Vitalik defined in an early post. And stage 2 is kind of when the training wheels are removed from the rollup. And there's questions about, is the smart contract bridge upgradable? Yeah, and so I think in the truest definition of rollup, I do think about them as stage 2, no training wheels, and they still post blobs to Ethereum DA. So yes.
All right. Can a dominant LST be permissionless money?
It's a good question. I think not, mainly because I don't see a construction where a dominant LST is not controlled by a DAO. And in the world where a DAO has control over the asset itself, I don't see that as like a stable equilibrium in a long-term, valuable, kind of anti-fragile way to hold your value on chain. So I say no.
Well, for the next one, I can answer. The ticker is ETH. The second one, how does ETH win and stay relevant for the next 100 years?
Yeah, I guess I still believe in kind of the core values that Vitalik talked about in his opening talk, which is focusing on credible neutrality, focusing on censorship resistance, and kind of this World War III grade security. I think that's kind of the only way to be anti-fragile in the way that we need to last 100 years.
Mike, do you believe in an end game for insurance? Can we figure it out, a final idea insurance curve? Is it important for moneyness to avoid touching the insurance curve?
Yeah, so I do think it's a tough trade-off to make, because moneyness, I think, does depend on having strong assurances about the asset itself, right? Like the first thing we talked about was the total supply. It has changed over time, the issuance rate. We went from 5 ETH to 3 ETH to 2. I'm not sure if it's possible to find an ideal curve. I think it's an important question that hopefully more macroeconomics people will help us think through. But I do think the risks of not touching the curve potentially outweigh the benefits of having kind of not touched it if we don't in that case. So it's kind of a non-answer, but I think we should at least kind of walk through the analysis of what's the risk of touching it, like how does that impact the credible neutrality of the total asset itself, versus the kind of risks of not changing it, which is you have a very high stake rate, you potentially have a single dominant LST. There's many trade-offs, and I think it's hard to say without a longer forum. Yeah.
If ETH is permissionless money, why do we need Bitcoin?
I think Bitcoin serves a role as kind of pet rock, right? You sit and you hold it under your bed, and it doesn't do anything, but you know that like it's very stable. But I think ETH kind of represents something more dynamic. And I do think scaling the L1 in some capacity to make sure that we kind of have the strong settlement assurances and property rights for ETH, and it's still valuable to interact with it on the L1, but also scaling it out to rollups and validiums make it a much more kind of useful, interactive asset than Bitcoin itself.
When Mev burn?
I don't know. I'll defer that one to Barnabé, maybe.
Well, for the last question to wrap up, I think the audience wasn't happy with my answer. So for Mike, what is the ticker?
The ticker is ETH.
Mike, thank you so much. Thank everyone for joining this session.